I'm Audrey Shiplett. I'm with the South Carolina Department of Education in the newly named Office of Grant Services. It used to be the Grants Program for a very, very long time. But today I'm going to talk with you about the importance of your subaward agreement, some expectations for subgrantees, things that our program offices want you to know and understand. I'll deal a little bit with updated regulations and then give you some recommendations and tips for better grants management. You do have access to these slides in the WUVA app, so you won't have to take pictures. You can just get them from the app. I always like to begin with my disclaimer because I'm not going to tell you everything you could possibly need to know, because just like Tiffany Kessler, I've been doing this for a few decades, and I could talk with you for the rest of the day and the rest of the week and still probably wouldn't cover everything that you should possibly need to know. What I try to do is give you starting points for furthering your journey and these steps. So we'll start with your subaward agreement, which is very important, and it has very important details for you and how you manage your grant. Now, how many of you have access to a copy of your subaward agreement? Great. Make sure that you always get a copy and that the folks who work with you on your project have access to a copy so that everybody can read through the details. They're not long. Our longest ones were for the emergency funds. They ran 5 pages, but it's divided up into different sections. For you guys, for importance in managing your federal award, there are specific sections that we have to have the federal information in, and that includes items 2, item 7, item 10, and item 12, which 12 being the applicable regulations, which is very important. Now, don't get freaked out about applicable regulations because, like Tiffany mentioned, 2 CFR Part 200, cross-cutting, it applies across federal agencies. U.S. Department of Education is just one of them. So there are a lot of regulations that are going to apply in the same ways across your different federal grants. This document is important for you to refer back to during the time that you are managing your grant, during that period of performance, and especially during your budget cycles. Understand that the scope of work section of it is probably the most important section. We have to follow federal regulation and what we put in this subaward document that we're giving to you. And part of the federal regulation says to us that we have to give you closeout information. So we've tried to build that up so you know after the period of performance what you have to do to close out the award and when your record retention period is. And I'll give you a slide in a few minutes that will give you some details on that. If there are specific limitations or conditions about your award, maybe there was something in your district's risk assessment that compelled our program office to put some specific limits or special conditions on your award. That should all be detailed in the scope of work section. Also, the reporting requirements. So just always remember when you're working with federal funds, the state's federal fiscal year ends June 30th. So you will always, for your federal subgrant funds, have to report all of your expenditures through June 30th by August 15th. Every year, that does not change, and that is a hard, fast set deadline. And our news history is riddled with school districts who've made the news because they missed that deadline and they couldn't get those Title I funds or those IDEA funds that they left on the table. So it's in your grant award, you want to pay attention to that reporting deadline, but all of the reporting deadlines that are in your sub-grant agreement. There will also be things that we have to conclude and pass through to you because they get included in our federal award. And sometimes laws change, which cause that. And this happened, and it keeps coming in continuing resolutions and other laws. We have to abide by it, and you have to abide by it. That basically, when you're issuing a bid or putting out a notice of how you're going to be using some of your funds, you've got to account for what percentage of the overall project is federal funds, what's non-federal funds. This all has to be made public under federal law. So that will be included in your subaward as well. And then the next important section of your subaward is about the applicable regulations. It can include the law that authorized the program that you're managing. It will include cross-cutting regulations like 2 CFR Part 200, but also 2 CFR Part 2, 2 CFR Part 170, 175, 180. Those, like Tiffany said, they apply across different federal agencies as part of Title II of the Code of Federal Regulation. We'll talk about that a little bit more in just a minute. But those aren't going to be going away. They're still going to apply even if the U.S. Department of Education's programs get disseminated out and presented through other federal agencies. State laws and provisos get shared through this. And another way that they get shared are through our agency's assurances and terms and conditions. So just like your subaward document, you're going to want to read the assurances and terms and conditions. Again, not long, about 4 pages. If you have competed for the funds, meaning that you've entered one of our competitions, you've read a request for proposals, you submitted an application by a deadline, it was reviewed by reviewers and scored, and then you got notification that you got an award, those assurances and terms and conditions may be within that request for proposals, and you may have signed, or your superintendent may have signed a certification signature page for applying. Another way is if you are applying for formula funds. The Office of Federal and State Accountability will provide this assurances and terms and conditions document through GEMS as part of your application process. So you have access to it. You'll need to keep a copy of it because it adds on to some of these applicable regulations with applicable state provisos and applicable limits that the state sets, like things for per diem or requiring that if you're going to go travel on behalf of your grant, you have to stay at a hotel at the GSA rate. That's all in our assurances and terms and conditions. So just like your subaward document sets terms for your agreement and is legally binding, so are our assurances and terms and conditions. So you should take those two together in understanding how to manage your grant. So with that said, let's talk about some expectations, which kind of boil down to expectations about your project, your budget, and the rules. And some of what I'm going to share with you now tie to things that the program offices at our agency want you to know, because they'll come and tell me. They may not be as direct with you. So they knew I was talking today, and I actually presented earlier this month at a statewide group of financial folks. And I'll share some of the things that they said earlier too. But one of the big things that the program offices want you to understand is about your subaward notification, and that this is legally binding. It's an agreement between your district and our agency. You do not have an agreement between your district and the federal agency that the funds came from. Our agency does. We have a binding legal agreement with the federal agency, and then we turn around when we subaward to you and we make an agreement with you. We're the go-between, we're the pass-through, we're responsible for monitoring you, assessing your risk, and following up on any monitoring or audit findings about how you've managed that subaward that we've given to you. Also understand that it's got to be fully executed before your district can get access to the funds. So it's very important that you ensure that it gets signed, and if you need to have the assurances and terms and conditions signed, they have to be signed both by your superintendent and your chief financial officer, but that's got to be fully executed, meaning you've received an award that our superintendent has signed, you send us back the signed documents, and at that point, once our Office of Federal State Accountability or whatever other office at our agency is managing the subaward program, once they have the fully executed agreement back, then you can get into gaps and start establishing your roles if you need new roles established. But you can begin to get the funds at that point. And just a reminder, it's here. The assurances and terms and conditions may also need to be signed for your specific subaward, depending on when the subaward was issued, if there have been new ones that have come out since the time. They get updated annually, or in the case when there are changes to regulations, they can get updated in the middle of the year. But there may be times when you will have to sign a new one. So another thing that they want you to know is know your project inside out. Now, part of that is keeping a copy of the instructions that you applied under, whether that's through GEMS, whether you responded to a request for proposals. You need to keep that documentation so you can refer back to it in case you have questions. Your approved plan, your approved subaward, the assurances and terms and conditions, all of those need to be in your file. And then as you're managing your grant, anytime that you want to issue or want to have a budget amendment and you start that communication with the program office, you need to keep a record of that professional communication, whether your budget amendment was approved, and then all the documentation of the effect that that has on your project with that budget amendment. So retain all of that in your files and be sure to communicate with your program people that you work with at your district so they understand the effects those amendments are having on your program and on your budget as well. So speaking of budget, these are direct quotes from our program offices, okay? They want you guys to be on top of it, and not just the people like me who went to college and said, I'm an English major, okay? I took math for English majors. I don't know anything about these budgets. I don't know anything about accounting and all. And your program people at least need to understand how the funding works and when there are changes to the funding, the effect that that's going to have on your project. And then also, if you have some of these allowable expenditures like salaries or equipment or technology, there may be other requirements if you're using federal funds for those. Like if you're using federal funds for salaries and benefits, you've got to keep documentation about those. And that's not going to change depending on if the federal source of the funds changes. Anytime, just keep that in mind. Anytime you're getting any federal money, and I say this because there were some districts when the emergency funds came out that thought, oh, we got to get them out. And for some reason, didn't initially start keeping that time and effort documentation. Okay, that time and effort documentation for use of federal funds is always going to be required. Don't leave it up to our agency to remind you. Just know if you're using federal funds for salaries, benefits, additional documentation is required. If you're using federal funds for equipment, inventory control documentation is always going to be required. So you don't want to be caught up short If a monitor walks in and wants to look at your inventory control and asks you, where are these laptops located right now? Those are things you need to be on top of. Your budget period, start and end dates, and pay attention because those are going to be changing in your subaward. They used to be consistent. Your performance period and your budget period, start and end dates were exactly the same. You may have some awards now that are going to come to you because the regulations we have to follow have changed. It may have a 5-year performance period, but they'll have a 1-year budget period. So pay attention to what's communicated in your subaward document about your performance periods and your budget periods. And then always your due dates for your reporting and your expenditure reports. And these are a rule of thumb too. Expenditure reports, we want you to be making expenditure reports at least quarterly. Our program offices would prefer for you to do it monthly, but we can't require you to do that. We can't require it because the federal regs tell us we can't require you to do more than quarterly. But we would like you to do monthly because it's just a better reflection of how you're really using the funds. And at any point in time, a member of our congressional delegation can turn to their staff and say, how's South Carolina using Title I funds? And if you haven't been up on top of submitting your expenditures to us for reimbursement, the amounts that they pull at the federal level aren't going to be indicative of how we really have needs and how we're really using the funds. So that's really why our agency would like for you to submit your expenditures monthly. You will be judged by the program offices and in our annual risk assessment that by regulation we have to do if you're not at least making quarterly expenditures on your projects. So, and that will negatively affect your risk assessment. So just keep that in mind. Another thing along these lines is knowing the rules. And this is where the legislation and the laws that authorize the programs that you manage really comes into play. And I think Tiffany stressed it today, but it's just important. You're all managing funds under the ESSA, but know which section specifically applies to your program so that when you see things that are being proposed for changes, you can track how's that going to affect your program. And then under laws, they have the same effect as laws, but they're not laws, they're regulations. And Edgar, everybody's boyfriend, right? Or Jewel, you hit it just in time for Jewel's boyfriend, Edgar. Is going to apply to all of your subawards from us that are U.S. Department of Education funds. You'll find that in box 7, front page of your GAN. It'll tell you who the federal funder is. Sections of EDGAR will be specified under the applicable regulation section, so you'll know which parts of EDGAR apply directly to the project that you're managing. And these are just some examples of the regulations there. And understand that the Electronic Code of Federal Regulations is your friend. It's easy to use. It's easy to bookmark. I'll take you through. There have been some updates to it because new regulations were announced last April. And these are just some of the common sections of the Code of Federal Regulation you might have to go to. Title 34 is U.S. Department of Education's part of the regs. Title 7 is the U.S. Department of Agriculture, for any of you that have a hand in some of the National School Lunch Funds or things that might be coming into your districts. You can access all of these regs at ecfr.gov. But just a few slides now about how these regulations have changed. So in last August, the Office of Management and Budget announced updates to the regulations. They changed some of the language. So when you go to Title II now in the ECFR, it no longer says guidance for grants and agreements. It says federal financial assistance to make it broader because they've been making things broader. They've expanded out to CFR Part 25 to include loans and other parts of the federal government assistance that can go out that they wanted under that reg. They're just kind of changing the language here to make it clear that this is going to apply to all federal financial assistance. But the Uniform Grant Guidance is still referred to as the Uniform Guidance, the UGG, the UGG, things that we talk about refer to it as. So on this slide, the highlighted language is additions to this section, which is on internal control, into CFR Part 200. So the first thing you see there, you must establish and document your internal controls. So we've always been telling you, you've got to document your processes and procedures. They've now formalized it in the regulations. So if you work with a team that's been reluctant to start documenting things, you've got to go back and get them on it because this is part of what's going to go into effect July 1st this year. So we're at the agency updating some of our policies and procedures. I'm going to give you a list in a minute of things that auditors and monitors will be looking for. But some other things you see here, alignment that should align with COSO frameworks or the federal Green Book. And those are just kind of overarching designs for internal controls. It can be overwhelming, but you do want to start looking at those, start working with your office out to different offices in your district to make sure that your internal controls are aligning with these. Because again, this is in the regs that are going to start July 1st. And I'll show you in a few minutes, you actually probably already have some awards that are under the new regs just because of how the new awards have come out. So monitors are now going to be looking for your alignment with COSO or the Green Book. Monitors are going to be looking for your documented internal controls. Monitors are going to be looking for your strengthened protection of PII, personally identifiable information. And they've written in now that you have to take cybersecurity measures because that's where we're all vulnerable, right? So these are just some examples of how the regs have been updated. And I'm going to show you a resource at the end that you're all going to want because it's a crosswalk from the old reg to the new reg that will show you exactly in an Excel spreadsheet, which everybody loves, right? You can sort it, you can search on it, but it'll show you how these regulations change. So now required and suggested written policies. Okay, don't freak out because a lot of these policies have been required for a long time now. So your district has these. What you're going to want to do is just refresh your memory about them and just check against the regulation that references them, which I've got here, to see if there's anything in that reg that needs to be pumped up, or maybe, and this happens a lot, you have a written policy or a written procedure that references an old reg, and that's like the first tip off to a monitor or an auditor. They love to find that because it's like, oh, they haven't updated this. What haven't they updated further? So look at these regs and how they've changed and compare them to your district's policies and procedures. And then there are some new things that have been added to the regulations for which you're going to need policies and procedures. And one is the participant support costs. There is a definition of what they're talking about as participant support costs. And we're still working on ours at the agency. And I can tell you what Tiffany Kessler recommended to us, because the regs say that it has to, written in your policies and procedures, so you have to provide participant support costs in alignment with your documented policies and procedures. So what Tiffany Brewman suggested to us is that we specify in our policies and procedures for which different programs. Okay, so for title, when we receive funds from the U.S. Department of Education, or I guess now when we'll say when we receive funds from the federal government for Title I, the following participant support costs are allowable. And just break it down by your different grants that you receive or sub-grants that you receive. And we're going to have to do that as well, because we have subawards from U.S. Department of Education, U.S. Department of Agriculture, but we've also got EPA, we've got FEMA, we've got different federal agencies. And it's impossible to do one policy that will cover all of the possible allowable costs for participant support. So you'll want to take some time on this policy, talk with the other program folks in your district, talk with your finance folks, talk with your administrative folks, and come up with something that spells out a policy and a procedure that you can follow, and that you can say we're being consistent with this, because that's what an auditor or a monitor is going to look for when they come in. And then the last one here is it's suggested that you have a whistleblower protections policy. We are working on ours. This is where if your district has a general counsel or legal support, this is really who you want putting this policy together and working with your HR office, because the policy has to be announced district-wide. It's got to be announced to all your staff as far as what the whistleblower protections are, not just staff who are working with the federal grant program. So along these same lines, now policies define the standards for how things are going to be done. Your procedures tell how you're actually implementing and doing things. So again, these are procedures for the most part that you probably already have in place. You just need to check and make sure that they are up to the standards. But you'll see here, you do need some procedures around those participant support cost classifications, and probably something, these allowability procedures, which that's where you get to the questions of how you determine if the expense is necessary, allocable, reasonable for spending federal funds. You might want to tie some of those determinations also into your participant support cost procedures, just to tie that you're not just saying, oh, we have this cost, it should be allowable for this, but is it really needed in this instance for this program? So at this point, let's look. Again, Tiffany reminded you that the effective date is October 1st for new and amended awards. But I'm going to take you a little deeper into what she was saying with the effective dates. So basically, these new regs were announced in April. OMG said federal agencies, if you're ready, meaning if you have your new policies and procedures in place and you're ready to go forward, you could implement these regs July 1st, 2024 if you want. And as Tiffany said this morning, none of the federal agencies decided to do that. So what that put into place was October 1st for new and amended awards. Now, that amended is where some of you already have Title I funds that are under these new regs. Because unlike what IDEA did in September 2024, before October 1st, 2024, IDEA pushed out their remaining funds. So they came out September 30th. So they're under the old regulations until the new award comes out this July 1st, around that time. Title I put out their amendment October 1st. So that puts your 25 Title I is under these new regs. And then U.S. Department of Education issued their guidance on July of an FAQ of, how these new regs are going to work. And that guidance said new awards October 1st or amended awards October 1st. And then January came. And this isn't for what you think, okay? So watch the dates on this next. So this was when, and Tiffany mentioned this morning, the Biden administration put out this announcement in the Federal Register, and it put us all into noncompliance for all of our federal U.S. Department of Education funds, because U.S. Department of Education said all of the new and amended, but all of the U.S. Department of Education's funds are now under the new guidance. So, and I can tell you, South Carolina Department of Education was not ready. We don't have our PMPs updated. We were immediately non-compliant. You guys, I'm sure any of y'all ready to be in the new regs yet? Y'all were all non-compliant. Fortunately, I did not know about this in January. Did any of y'all know about that we were all non-compliant? Yes, I didn't know about it until Tiffany sent us this announcement in the Federal Register, which I called it, they walked it back. That, no, basically goes back to how it was to begin with. October 1st, 2024 for new awards or amended awards. Like we got an amendment to our Title I. That's why your 25 Title I is in effect. So how do you know which ones are under the new regulations? We've tried to make that clear in your subaward document. So look for language like this that's highlighted as updated by the Federal Office of Management and Budget on April 22nd, 2024. We worked with our general counsel's office and kind of came up with this language because it's not just 2 CFR Part 200. Like I said, they updated Part 180, 175, 170. There are other ones that apply to you. And currently, these are the subawards. So we have that 25 Title I and any of the streams coming off from that. We've made awards for distinguished schools and the LEA Award for Neglected and Delinquent. And then there is one of our U.S. Department of Agriculture subawards, the Fresh Fruit and Vegetable subaward that was just issued. And it's one that I think they issued that award to us in November. So we're tracking which ones are kind of piecemeal coming on during this time period. And then, of course, as of our new fiscal year, July 1st, we'll have the formula funds that will come in, and those will all be under the new regulations. So, marching on, recommendations. So reading is fundamental. It still is. Read everything carefully. Get the other folks you work with to read things. Share your questions. If you receive guidance from any of our offices that you don't understand, read carefully, ask questions, refer back to their language. Let them know what you have questions about. And then, we may all have a lot of questions of guidance coming from the federal government. And we'll just see, but everything we got to read carefully. Then this one I was presenting earlier this month to LEA finance folks. And when I got to my version for them of this slide, I had folks say, "Oh, we don't think that's happening. We're talking with them." I said, well, invariably somebody comes up to me after a presentation when I've said, please communicate among your district with your finance office. Invariably somebody will hang around, and they actually did from my presentation earlier this month. Someone came up to me afterwards and said, I've been saying this about our district for the longest time, but no one will talk in finance. So if you need to start with the bookkeeper at your school, start with the bookkeeper at your school, but start having conversations about your project. Because with all the federal regulations, with all the changes, you can't manage effectively working as a solo project in just the program office. You need the finance office to understand that you've got to put things in GEMS and the time frames and how GEMS works. You need to understand from them how their system works and by what time frames they need information for you for getting your expenditure request processed. So if you're not currently meeting with your finance office, start with your bookkeeper and try to work up through there to make some connections so that your finance office can see the value of this. And this is something that a district CFO told me probably, 10, 12 years ago. And this person was actually at this conference earlier because 10, 12 years ago, she was saying, we meet with them twice a year. We meet with all of our programs twice a year. And we talk about what their plans are and what their time frames are and what their calendar is for when they got to get expenditures in and all this. When I saw this person at the conference earlier this month, and I asked about how's it going because you inspired me with this, and they said, we meet monthly now. Because of the changes in the regs, because of the value of that communication, they realized that they could get a lot accomplished. And some of those monthly meetings now may just be 15 minutes of just a check-in. But it gets that communication going, and it helps with overall grant management. And of course, talk to your program offices here. If you need for your program office to talk with our grants accounting office so that our grants accounting office can talk to your district's finance office, that can be arranged. But have those communication lines open so that you can do that. One of my previous bosses used to say, finance talks to finance, program talks to program. Yeah, the little silos, but we're trying to get you guys to interweave that for better grants management. And then this is just a rule of thumb, document, especially now with everything that's going on. And I would say document date and time. As of this time, on this date, this was going on because the landscape is shifting fast and moving pretty quickly. And just this is good guidance here for your record retention period. I won't go through it because I think I'm getting close on time. And just understand your records have to be retained. That's in our assurances and terms and conditions, and also in the scope of work for your subaward. And when that retention period starts, it starts after closeout. It doesn't start the end day of your performance period. Another thing to remember, just follow routines, have a calendar for your project. And that's where it can be helpful to know your finance office's calendar too, because you can see where things sync up. And maybe they're going to be busy for about 6 weeks, so you're going to need to get your last quarter expenditure reports into them very early to ensure that they get processed. There can be situations like that. And along this record about routines, here we are in March. What should you be doing? Thinking about, do you need budget amendments between now and the end of June? Check the scope of work for your subawards, because some program offices have earlier deadlines for expenditure reports. 21st Century, for example, will have a May deadline for for budget amendments. Sorry. You'll need to get those done early. And then remember, there are no non-competitive procurements using federal funds. So if you are planning goods and services for the next school year, you need to be working on your procurement of those now, so that you don't have folks from the Office of Federal and State Accountability saying, no, we can't approve that. That's not a sole source. So start your procurements now. And then, of course, as I mentioned earlier, that August 15th deadline is set in stone. So plan to have your expenditure reports by the end of the state's fiscal year, June 30th, ready to go. Well ahead of August 15th, please. It's just helpful if you can get them in the earlier, the better. So on this resources slide, the COFA over here, the Council of Federal Financial Aid, and again, you have access to all these slides in Whova, but you're going to want to go to their site because they have some awesome resources on the new regulations in Title II of the Code of Federal Regulations, including, I've highlighted that 2 CFR crosswalk. It's one huge Excel spreadsheet, which you can do your subtabs, pull over the regulations from 2 CFR and plug it in. And it's a great crosswalk because you can go to search for the old regulation number and see out in the line item how the language was changed specifically. It's like a red line out. Now, they also have red line edits for the regs, but that spreadsheet is so helpful. It can help you with updating your policies and procedures. It can help you with just having a conversation with others in your district about, oh, here's how the regs have changed. They struck through this, they added this language, and a lot of the reasons for the language changes were to try to make language clearer. So, for example, you won't see non-federal entity in the regulations anymore, okay? You will see recipient, which is the direct grant recipient, like State Department of Education gets direct grant, and you will see subrecipient, meaning you guys the subrecipient has gotten a subgrant from a pass-through entity like us. So no more non-federal entities. That's just an example of how they've cleaned up some of the language in the regulation, and you can see all of that in that crosswalk. It's very useful. And then with those 2 changes that the U.S. Department of Education made and the Federal Register in January and February, okay, the bad news for all of us is you need to keep a copy of both of those in your grant file, okay? Because remember, they made us all non-compliant, and then they made us compliant again. So, and it actually says at the end of the announcement to keep it in your files. So you'll want to go and get those. I recommend you keep electronic copies, but just to have that in the case that monitor or an auditor wants to see it, because it did affect all of your subawards from us of U.S. Department of Education funds, just U.S. Department of Education funds, just those subawards. And it affected all of ours too. So we have to do the same thing, is keep those on record. So we are a little out of time, but if you have any quick questions, otherwise, this is about what we know, right? Just produce a crystal ball. We'll all guess. If you think of things afterwards, feel free to reach out to us. LaShonda and I will be happy to help you. And thank you all for your time today. And I appreciate the opportunity to be with you.